I'm here because Sudarshan said if you come through Delhi, drop by and say hello and give us a talk. And so I did. I was dropping by. Actually, I went fishing on the Ganges. You see, because my nephew, he's a fisherman. He graduated from Yale. He was president of the fishing club. And he started a business taking very wealthy people fishing for mahshir and trout up on the Ganges and Asi Ganga. And he charges them a fortune. I mean, they pay $1,000 or $2,000 every day to do fishing. So he's going back to school now. He's been out of college for 3 or 4 years. So I said, listen, Aaron, before you go back to school, you have to take me fishing up there. So I came for a board meeting last week. I went up to the Ganges. I did catch 4 fish. And then I came down, and I'm on my way through to Beijing. I'm going to talk a little. I gave Sudarshan a couple of titles, and he passed around some of the titles, and the one that was selected by your faculty. So if you don't like this talk, then you have to blame them, because they selected it. But it's on this Brac, an NGO in Bangladesh, and the theme is freedom from want, because that is the mission of Brac, which is to eradicate or to control or to alleviate poverty. And I'm going to not only explain a bit of the Brac story, but I will interject some of my personal and professional interactions with Brac so that you're aware of the conflict of interest, since I'm not an impartial observer of the Brac story. I'm actually quite a partisan. But I also feel, as a partisan, that I know many aspects of the story that a more objective analysis would not be able to illuminate. So with that, this is the logo web page from my foundation. Just to let you know, we're 98 years old. We're a foundation that funds work in medical universities today in China primarily, but also all through Asia. We've, in the last 60 years, funded medical university developments from Japan all the way through to Burma and Myanmar. And currently, we're focused on China and the 5 Mekong countries: Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. I'm not going to talk more about the China Medical Board, although that again is a fascinating story, because John D. Rockefeller had a great attachment to the poor people of China, and he wanted to help. So he introduced this foundation to develop modern medicine in China, and he endowed it with his own money, and 98 years later, it's still paying my salary, which is, again, another story of the durability of wealth and how long it can last and the kind of impact it can have. But either fortunately or unfortunately for you, I'm not going to talk at all further about the China Medical Board. Actually, I'm going to talk about a phase in my life and career that goes back earlier. This is the book. I'm sorry, I loaded this book page cover up, and I couldn't get it to sit right, so a more IT specialist could have done it well. But basically, this is a book by Ian Smiley on freedom from want, and it is the story of Brac. It's a wonderful story. I won't, of course, repeat this book, but its book has sold very, very well. This is, and I'm sorry that, okay, thank you. I'm sorry that this you cannot read, and don't bother trying. But Brac is a non-governmental organization that is estimated to be reaching about 126 million people worldwide. But unlike many global NGOs, perhaps like your global university, this one did not start in the North. I was, by the way, the chair of the board of CARE, which is a global and non-governmental organization, but it started in the United States and Canada and then shifted to now something like 60 or 80 countries. But Brac started in Bangladesh, still concentrates its work in Bangladesh but now is working in 11 countries. Okay? And this is what it does. It provides microfinance. Notice that it currently, in Bangladesh alone, has 5.5 million borrowers, and it's turned over almost $10 billion in loans. It's a huge, huge operation. The 5.5 million borrowers are around a third of the total microfinance customers in Bangladesh. The other third might be serviced by Grameen Bank. How many of you have heard of Grameen Bank? Almost, yes. Almost all of you have. So Yunus's Grameen Bank is about the same size as Brac. There's another NGO in Bangladesh called Aisha, ASA, that's also the same size. So between the three of them, they comprise the 18 million borrowers in Bangladesh. But Brac, this year, in 2012, will be dispersing about $800 million US equivalent in microfinance loans in Bangladesh, of which, and you'll see some of the statistics later, they will realize for the organization about $40 million in profit. So this is an NGO that's running a very, very large enterprise of microfinance. It's a poverty-oriented program. The credit goes to women's groups, about 10 women, and each individual woman guarantees the other woman loan guarantee. I was in Bangladesh with the Ford Foundation when Brac and Grameen Bank started, and I can vouch for the fact that Brac was as easily as early in microfinance and as large as Yunus, who has gotten almost all of the international credit, which is another story in of itself about how you get international credit versus how you do the international work. Here is Brac's village health program. The Shasta Shabikas are village health workers. There's 100,000 of them in Bangladesh, and they provide basic health care in the villages. The Shasta Shabika model by Brac is very interesting. They are self-financing. They do not receive a fee or a salary. They sell their medicinal products. But the medicinal products are all carefully vetted and purchased as generics and then sold at a very, very small markup. And quite often the Shasta Shabikas are linked to the microfinance groups because they actually take loans out for their health work. I was involved in not the Shasta Shabikas, that Brac did, but in looking at this program because about 12 or 14 years ago, Brac as an NGO faced the challenge, were they going to stay dependent on donor money to finance the salary of all of these workers, or were they going to find a financially sustainable model of their own? They found this financially sustainable model. It's got imperfections because the Shasta Shabikas cannot provide the full range of services given the financial imperatives, but it's an interesting experiment that has had a very large health impact in the country because 100,000 workers are in every village of the country. Brac also has a very, very interesting primary school education program. This one shows a school in southern Sudan where Brac works, and currently those statistics are for Brac's school, primarily in Bangladesh, about 1 million students enrolled. But the Brac primary schools are complementary to the government schools. So this NGO believes that the philosophy, by the way, feel free to interrupt me with a question at any time. Okay, I should have said that at the beginning, but it's very interesting. They feel the government should provide universal primary education. So why do they create the school? Well, you have to be a dropout of a government school to get enrolled in a Brac primary school. And you have to be 1 or 2 years older than your age cohort for that grade. And as a result, 2/3 of their students are girls rather than boys. So it's a very, very interesting complement to the government primary system and the complementarity of the Brax school system. They are like a franchise almost, in the sense that this is heavily subsidized and paid for by Brac, but they have a template of, I think it's 30 students or 20 students and one village teacher. And it's a very, very standard rollout, so they can expand any number of schools very quickly or contract very, very quickly. It's like a McDonald's or something like that, but very successful results of the students who have caught up and then gone on. But they're all dropouts, and most are girls, and this is complementary to the government's primary school work. Brac also focuses on adolescent girls, feeling that this is really one of the most vulnerable groups, and it's a group of important educational and socialization values. This is a group in Uganda where they teach life skills, but primarily focus on economics, actually, getting these young girls into income-generating activities, which has a lot of beneficial effects on all sorts of social problems of all kinds, from the boyfriends, girlfriends, to the sugar daddies, to a lot of social issues associated with this. But it's a very, very targeted entry. I feel this ultra-poor program of Brax is the most exciting program. It's now been tested in 10 different countries, and Ford Foundation and CGAP have done now essentially clinical trials with Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee from MIT. It's a highly successful program in recognizing that there are people who are too poor to be able to take microfinance and make a viable livelihood from it. They have to have asset transfer, so they actually receive free a cow or a goat and education and other kinds of training before they are graduated into microfinance. In India, you've had in Andhra Pradesh, the state government closing many of the microfinance because of suicide and compulsory repayments. And one of my hypotheses has been that you didn't have a Brac ultra-poor program because a certain segment of those who take the microfinance loan do not really have the asset base or the human capabilities to manage the microfinance and to repay. So you will have the failures rates. Whereas this program has a criteria for qualification. Once you enter into a highly subsidized program, but then you're also graduated out. And you're graduated, and the success rate has been fantastic from the controlled studies that have been funded by CGAP, which is with the World Bank, and the Ford Foundation. Actually, Esther Duflo's Tanner lecture this year was based on an ultra-poor program that she studied in West Bengal, the Brac model. And what she felt was that the ultra-poor program, the impact was not so much economic as it changed the sense of hope on the part of the desperately poor and the incapacitated. The mindset changed as to whether they could do something or not, and that this was more important than the actual physical transactions of funding. Well, let me tell you a little bit about those programs. This is the structure of Brac. It's a family of organizations. The 1972 is the Bangladesh program, which has development enterprises and a university. The enterprises are profit-making, but they're all social enterprises in the sense that they all, and I'll explain that later, relate to some part of the social production chain for which there is money generated, but the profits all go back to the development programs. There are no other profits. In 2001, about 10 years ago, 2002, Afghanistan started with its own incorporation, its own board, and then 10 countries have now come on board. And those have been grouped into a legal entity called Brac International. The two other Bracs, Brac UK and Brac USA, are basically what I would call public education and information, public relations, and also fundraising. And especially fundraising for the Brac International, because Bangladesh law prohibits Bangladesh from exporting its hard-earned money to other countries. And so Brac Bangladesh, despite the fact that it has the economic capacity, cannot support the Brac family in other countries. Those have to come from the fundraising outside. Oh, I should, in the interest of transparency, I am the chairman of Brac USA, and my wife is a board member of Brac Bangladesh. And I'll be showing you some of the background to that. So obviously, we're a family that has some connections and affinity to Brac. This is the program and enterprises in Bangladesh. You can see in the development programs the types of activities they have. I've mentioned some of them, like the health education and the ultra-poor program. But they also have quite a bit of legal and human rights advocacy and social justice, emergency relief, and food security programs. Most of these are integrated, so they work through the integrated field workers. They don't run these as separate entities. What is distinctive, truly distinctive about Brac are the social enterprises and investment. You can see there are about 15 to 20 independent companies. Those companies overall are all generating profit. But you can see from their titles, this is the Korean. By the way, they have a full Korean model on the dairy co-ops in Bangladesh. Brac has a full, dairy enterprise, but they've done it in all of it. In fisheries, in the eggs, in artificial insemination, in vaccines for the poultry, and obviously they're into printing and so forth. Actually, I remember the first printing press was donated by Oxfam and then they started the printing company, and then it's been turning over. But they've even now run TSAs. I think BracNet is, obviously an internet provider. One of their most successful is Brac Bank, which is not a microfinance bank. It's actually a small enterprise bank. It lends to small businesses. And I think the people that bought equity into that have made a fortune because it's just, it's grown tremendously. But all of the money that comes from the enterprises, as I indicated, are plowed back into the development program and the university. I'll talk about the university a little bit later. Here's the...
Sorry, who are the clients for the housing finance?
For the which one?
Brac housing.
Housing, they will build houses and then sell them, and they'll sell them in the public. Yeah. Some of them are aimed at the poor, okay? Actually, Brac, I think this is probably not public information. They may be the largest private landowner in Bangladesh. They have bought, over the last 30, 40 years, property after property after property. They have, one of Bangladesh's assets that people never recognized are its people. The people are very talented. And so they have a widely dispersed field operation with regional training facilities and so forth. And they're constantly training. And, by the way, since I was chair of CARE, another NGO, and now I'm chair of Brac, I know that one of the advantages of Brac is compared to CARE. CARE will start an office in Myanmar, and then they have to try to find some competent staff. Very hard. Brac, they just ship the next 5 guys out, and they've been trained for the last 10 to 15 years in the village work, and they're out there the next day. So they have a human resource pool in Bangladesh that's very, very, very talented. But the housing company would be basically building and then selling housing.
And not necessarily to their own members.
No, they also do that too. All of their staff are provided housing, subsidized housing and so forth and so on. But this is not, no, these are all businesses, yeah. And they're run as businesses. Okay, this is just an estimate of the reach. You can see the overwhelming number of clients that are reached of any of Brac services, the 126 million. Bangladesh has 90% of them, basically, and then the 10% are in these startups. The largest is in Afghanistan, the 5 million there, and then Uganda in Africa is doing the best. The other countries, as you can see, are almost all African except for Sri Lanka and Haiti, and the reasons for those are because of the disasters. You know, the tsunami and the earthquake, they went in afterwards, and now they're looking at Myanmar as well. But those Brac International operations are all financed by the Brac UK, Brac USA office in some way. And here's the financials of it. This is the remarkable thing. This is a $750 million business, or NGO, if you want to call it that. The self-generated income is almost $500 million a year. Okay, and then the donor contributions are diminishing, and then what we've been able to raise in the US and the UK and other places is not quite as much. As far as I know, Brac Bangladesh is negotiating a new donor agreement, which would be unprecedented with AusAid and with DFID. They're doing 5 years unrestricted core funding of Brac. Large, I think it's like $400 million or $500 million, unrestricted block grant for 5 years for development. In these two organizations, I've never heard of a donor doing this before, but obviously they have a lot of confidence in Brac. Yeah. By the way, you can keep these. You can keep these slides.
Like a Marshall Plan.
Yeah. Marshall Plan was block grants like that. Okay. Well, okay. Okay. Here's the seminar questions. Okay. Why has Brac been successful? Is it leadership, motivation, capabilities? Is it context and timing? Or is it just plain old good luck? Okay? And then for the public policy students, what has been the role of other institutions and policies? The government, the donors, other NGOs. And then, of course, the third question is, what about the future? So I'm going to speak a little bit about each of these things, and they will blend in some of my personal, as I pointed out, observations with Brac over the years. Okay? This is Abed, F.H. Abed, who is the founder and currently the executive chairman of Brac. He's won every prize in the world, perhaps except the Nobel Prize. And actually, Amartya Sen and I wrote letters saying to the Nobel Committee that they should have, before they awarded the prize, we argued that they should have given it to 3 people together, that Abed, Yunus, and Ilabat should have been co-awardees. But the committee didn't listen and gave it to Yunus, which led to Yunus's problems somewhat today. But Abed works in 11 countries. It's indisputably the world's largest NGO, and it's also the world's largest private secular educational provider. There are no other groups of this kind of scale. And let me comment on Abed by just showing you a few slides of my personal involvement so that you know why I understand some of these things. These are villages in Bangladesh. This would be the beginnings of Brac, where people would come together, and in the villages the meetings would take place and problems were discussed and then solutions were attempted. Brac is one of the biggest, what I would call, trial and error organizations. It makes mistakes all the time. The good thing about Brac is it throws the mistakes away. They don't make excuses, and then they go on and they try to learn something, and as soon as they hit something successful, it expands. And Abed never does anything as a pilot. His only interest is to go totally national, and I'll explain that in a second, okay? Okay? This is the first time Abed and his first wife, Bahar, was recognized. This is 1980. He won the Magsaysay Award, and you know that award here in India very well. Bahar died in childbirth that year. which was a huge trauma for all of us. And she was also a co-founder, essentially, of Brac. And this is, so I wanted to say something about the origins of success, but as I do that, let me just point out that that's my wife, Marty. She was the 23rd full-time employee of Brac. Okay? So, and she was Bahar's best friend. So when we were living in Bangladesh, she and Bahar together worked every day at Brac. And she's now, she teaches at, actually your equivalent, the Harvard Kennedy School in Public Policy. And she's a lecturer there, and she runs a global network on women and the informal economy. But anyways, she began her career at Brac. And Brac started in this area where you see me and my son. I'm in the back there, looking a lot younger, and my son is up close. Adrienne Germain, I don't know how many of you know Adrienne, but Adrienne is one of the world's great feminist women's health leaders, president of the International Women's Health Coalition in New York. Kushi Kabir is on the far left. That's Humayun Kabir's niece, yeah, who was the first education minister in India. You know, it was a Muslim family that split. But that's the Hori area, which is the inundated area of Sylhet province, in Sylhet district in Bangladesh. And that's where Brac started, because it was the war of independence and then the return of the refugees through Sylhet that led Abid to begin the work up there by actually floating housing material down, bamboo down through the Har area into Bangladesh from Assam. Now, let me see whether, okay, I'll finish up in Bangladesh. As Sudarshan said, I was a medical doctor working on cholera and diarrheal disease. And this is, I ran a rural hospital for children with malnutrition and diarrhea. And the mothers would bring the kids in with this. And then we developed the solution which mothers gave to their children, consisting of salt and sugar, or rehydration, which is the replacement of the fluid that's lost from cholera. And it's been a world important life-saving measure for the diarrheal diseases. So let me spend a second here and talk a bit about the origins of Brac. Abid was never going to be an NGO leader. He was in business. He was the treasurer of the Pakistan Shell Oil Company, living in Chittagong, because the oil rigs were down in the south. But the cyclone of 1970 hit the coastal area, and Abid and we were friends. Mostly because in Bangladesh there were just a few elite, he was trained in England, a few elite Bengali families, and a few foreigners. They're just a handful of foreigners. So we were friends because we were sort of Anglophile, you know, cocktails in the afternoon type of thing. But then we got involved in relief work. And his house, which was the Pakistan Shell Oil Company house, became the center for all the relief supplies. And my wife and I went down to the island. So he was at that time, he smoked a cigarette in a holder. He wore a silk smoking jacket from Britain, okay? He was trained in naval architecture, accounting, and finance. And he was just a business person. He memorized, he's brilliant, obviously, because he could quote any section from Shakespeare at any time. We're quite a genius guy. But he got involved in the relief work. Then Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was elected prime minister, essentially, but Bhutto canceled that, and then the civil war broke out. The Pakistan army came in and essentially committed atrocities and genocide against the East Bengalis. And my wife and I were evacuated. But Abid had to escape because he was an intellectual of sorts. And I won't go through the harrowing escape that he had. But I'm sure, in talking about the origins, that it must have been a traumatic, transformative experience to realize that you're privileged, you're wealthy, you're elite, but you're so vulnerable to being part of a genocidal wave. So he went to England, he went back to England, and he started a small NGO, okay? And we in the US began to send small amounts of money for disaster relief during the war. And that's when he began Brac. Okay? And then he decided that he was just going to help in the reconstruction of the country after, and he wasn't going to go back to Pakistan's Shell Oil Company. And it started as a very, very small NGO. I remember the small house. You know, my wife used to go down there. I used to go down for lunch once in a while. By the way, that story is very close to Muhammad Yunus's story. I knew Yunus when he was a PhD student in economics in the US at Vanderbilt. And I also knew Yunus as a Ford Foundation. He called me in the US saying, I want to do something for Bangladesh because of the war and all that. I'm going back. And I said, well, you can donate or whatever, a little bit that I knew, because we had a little bit of a movement in Bangladesh, in the US. But then when I came to Bangladesh with the Ford Foundation, he contacted me. He was then professor of economics at Chittagong University. So I said, I'll come down and see you. So I went down there. He was then married to a Russian-American girl, and they lived in a dormitory. It was a campus like yours, by the way, because it was a new campus, you know, and he had faculty, professors. And I stayed overnight in the guest quarters, but I had dinner with him in this quarters. And he said, look, you know, I think we should do something at this university because you see all that grass out there? And I said, yes. He said, you know, we have right outside the wall farmers who are starving to death, and we should allow them to plant the grass. You know, we don't need the grass. They could grow some rice there. So I said, gee, that's an interesting idea. So I went back to Dhaka. I flew back from Chittagong to Dhaka. And I went to, there were three of us at the Ford Foundation, George Seidenstein and Stephen Biggs from IDS Sussex. And Stephen was in charge of agriculture. I was in charge of health, population, and the social sciences. I was in charge of the social sciences, I want you to know, as a doctor. But so I said to Stephen Biggs, I said, you know, I think this guy's doing some very interesting stuff. So we actually gave him a grant for about $23,000 for him to bring the farmers in and test whatever ideas he had. Now, I can't claim that after that I had anything to do with his brilliant genius, but I can claim, because he's written it in the book, that I was one of the first people to see him and to try to offer some help, you know, just a little bit of support to Yunus. So, in any case, now, was it inherently leadership? Yeah. Yes. Was it motivation? Yes. Was it capability? Unbelievable capability. Was it context and time? Yes. And was it good luck? Gosh darn it, yes. All of those things were ingredients for the success of these NGOs, Brac and Grameen. None of those could have happened if one of those was absent. The context was not there, the luck and the timing was not there, or the brilliance and the capabilities of these individuals were not there, okay? Now, by the way, I'm telling you a story that they may not tell you, because by the way, I interviewed for National Public Radio, Yunus, for an hour and a half at the Kennedy Library about 4 years ago. He totally refused to accept I knew a lot about his program, but he had a pitch for the public that he was not going to deviate from. Let me give you two examples. Grameen model has gone to many other countries, okay? Including with Bill Clinton, who was down in Arkansas with Hillary. They put a Grameen model down in Arkansas. But I knew it was a failure in Arkansas. Why? Because my son, after graduating from the Kennedy School, he went down to rural Arkansas to work on that project, and he was living in a little hut. Greg, you know, he was living in that little hut, that little kid you saw. And he said, you know, it doesn't work because in the US, you know, you have to depend on guilt, whereas that's an individual problem. But in Bangladesh, the group makes all the difference. You know, the pressures to repay from the group dynamic. In the US, if you're running a barbershop and you don't pay, nobody pays any attention, you know. So he says, it doesn't work down here. So I said to Yunus, I said, you've had all these Grameen models all over the world. He says, they all work. And I went, you know, what could I say? You know? And then I knew that he had a lawsuit going on with the Norwegian investment company in Grameen phones. Yeah. which was a co-investment, okay? And he claims that the shares belong to all the women and all of that, right, okay? Of course, he controls all the women, all right? But Norwegians want their money, okay? Okay. But he was arguing for private sector partnerships, for profit partnerships at this interview. And I said, but aren't there some problems? He says, no, they're all great. So anyways, you get different lines. And by the way, Abid will be more modest about because he has no public persona in those regards. So I think in terms of the origins, all of those factors are successful. Now, what about the second question? What about the role of institutions, especially government, donors, and other NGOs? So let me just give you a little background. This is one donor group. This is a retreat of the Ford Foundation Delhi office about 1985, I would say. Yeah. And you see this guy in the bottom right. He's got a cup of tea. He's a very handsome guy in those days. But this is the office group. We used to go on retreat once or twice a year. Now, there's some very, very famous people, as it turns out. Yes. In addition to our dean here, okay? You know the person on the standing on the left is Shekhar Shah. Yes. He's now the president.
Director of the NCA. Yeah.
He's now the president of the National Council for Applied Economic Research in Delhi after coming back from the World Bank, where he went to afterwards. And then you'll see the guy sitting next to him, the second one in from the left. That's Ravi Narayan. Yes. And Ravi Narayan,
the National Stock Exchange, Bombay.
He's president of the National Stock Exchange in Bombay, okay? And the third and last person, and actually the most distinguished social reformer of the lot, is the guy sitting in the middle between the two ladies, okay? Does anybody know who he is? He's famous in India. No, but he's very, very... He's very, very shy. Yeah. He won the Magsaysay Award.
Pradhan. Founder of
the
Pradhan.
Lucknow guy, I'll tell you.
Founder of Pradhan.
Founder. IIT graduate.
Yes, he's an IIT graduate. That's Deep Joshi, who founded Pradhan with Vijay Mahajan, also out of the Ford office, right? Okay. And then Deep went on to do his social work, and he won the Magsaysay Award, 3 years ago? 5 years ago, huh?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's the rest of the foreigners are nobodies, but the young Indian groups really have been outstanding in terms of their career trajectories and their contributions in India. So I was associated with that. That's me, in case you don't see the Chinese guy. He's the third guy on the left standing, okay? And then these are the two guys that ran the office.
Good God. Where did you find these?
I found these in my file. You know? We were just young punks, really, But we had a great time with just the Bhagwati. We knew everybody, and we were doing all sorts of. But this is one donor group and the reason I'm citing the donors is because even though Yunus and Abid probably would say the donors did not have much to do with their success, I honestly believe that the donors, of course, gave bad advice, controlled too many things, et cetera, but they did provide some enabling resources, and those NGOs were heavily subsidized in their early years. They would never have taken off without that donor subsidy, which explains, I think this is the last, which explains, and I'll go into this, I co-founded a group called the Calcutta Group, and that's Amartya Sen and Shabana Azmi. They come every year. We have a one-day retreat in Calcutta where we talk about India's problems in education, health, and human development. And we usually we have some movie stars, actually, Shabana and this lady who just...
Nandita.
Nandita, yeah, but Nandita, yeah, Das, Nandita Sen, but also, I'm thinking of Sharmila Tagore. Sharmila always comes, yeah, okay. So those are the movie stars that come. Then we have some business people from Bombay. We have usually a couple of union ministers come. Your education minister was a frequent, Amantek Singh Ahluwalia and Ishwar have come. We have NGO leaders come, but it's a group of about 30, 35. And Shiva Kumar, who is in Delhi with UNICEF and is on the National Advisory Committee, runs this, and UNICEF pays for it. But again, it's a way where I get to sort of see a range of activities, and I wanted to comment on this because I mentioned the donors being an enabling support, but I also wanted to comment on government and government policy, because this is my visit in 1981 or 82 to Jaya in the Working Women's Forum down in Tamil Nadu.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Arunachala.
Jaya, now she, along with Ela Bhatt and others, were very early innovators in the microfinance field. This is 1980, 81 now, remember that. 90, 2000, that's 30 plus years ago. And again with women's groups, okay? But none, Ela Bhatt's group has taken off somewhat, but still the scale is, you know, it's 1/20th the scale of Brac.
Yeah.
Okay? Now the question is why? And I believe the government can either enable or constrain NGO growth. And I think the Indian government, Sudarshan knows this because he had to negotiate with the Indian government, constrained and put caps on the NGO growth. They would not allow these groups to go to the scale that Brac has. So some of the scale in Bangladesh and Brac comes from either a relaxed, a positive, or a lazy government in Bangladesh, where they are not cracking down with the foreign registration laws, looking down on donors and so forth. The Indian government would never allow a foreigner to come in at the $100 million kind of funding levels for just an NGO.
The whole of Andhra microcredit had that.
The whole what? Andhra.
Andhra microcredit experiment which collapsed.
Yes.
All foreigners sitting in multi-million-dollar salaries. Heading the microfinance institute.
Those collapsed, right? Yeah. I'm not I think there was one, AKS, is that it? Yeah. SKS, yeah. That was a for-profit. By the way, that guy also went to public policy. He's a graduate of the Kennedy School. He was in my wife's class. And she said he wasn't all that smart. In class, he wasn't all that smart. Anyways, but he was at the Kennedy School as a student, okay? He came out here. But he ran it as a for-profit and for an investment, right? I don't think that's the case with Vijay Mahajan, is it? Is that also the case?
Basic, no.
No. Basic is very different. But those other NGOs, the nonprofit NGOs, have taken a hit. And by the way, we can talk about this as to what's positive or negative about government's entry into the microfinance. I think it's quite mixed, you know, because every 10 years, politicians come and they forgive all the loans. They completely destroy the industry, you know. So anyways, I feel that the government has a lot to do with whether Brac was able to grow and change the way it did. I was going to mention the donors. The other NGOs, basically, they're compatible in Bangladesh. They didn't compete, or they get along pretty well. I mean, they, you know, Abid and Yunus, for example, they're not great friends, but they're not enemies at all. And they both, you know, respect each other's activities, and they work in their space. This is the future, and here's Abid. He comes to our Brac board meeting every year in September. We usually have a dinner of dignitaries with him. That's Elaine Wolfenson there, who's a great fan of Brax, but he's usually trying to raise money when he's standing up at dinner. And then, you know, I basically noted under the future that I wanted to emphasize three areas. One is the university, the second is organizational evolution, and the third is the whole issue of leadership succession, which is a big question in all organizations, in public policy as well. This is the university. It started 10 years ago. It now has an enrollment of 3,500. It's grown very quickly. It's now rated the third best university in Bangladesh. The first are two public universities, Dhaka University and the Engineering College. This is the third. They've also started a school of public health there.
Who is James P. Grant?
Head of UNICEF.
James Grant was a distinguished and
I told you
charismatic
about
head of...
James Grant in class, the progenitor of the idea of the MDGs. One promise, immunize every child.
What he didn't tell you is that John Grant, Jim Grant's father, worked for my foundation in China. He's a Scottish-Canadian physician, spoke fluent Chinese, and he lived and worked in China for 10 or 15 years before coming to India, where he's one of the co-authors of the very famous board committee on setting up the health system in India. He made a mess of India, I think. The board committee actually made some very bad mistakes because it was hoping that India would adopt the British system that it never totally failed to adopt. So all the public policy rhetoric is the British system, but the implementation was never there. Anyways, it's a long, long story about John Grant. He was called the Bolshevik doctor in China because he was very leftist center, and he actually started the barefoot doctors movement in the 1920s and 30s that the communists adopted in the 1960s. So very, very charismatic. And James Grant always tried to live up to his father. You know. I went with James Grant when he was dying of cancer to Beijing 3 months before he died, and he was having his last visit to China, and I was one of the speakers at that conference. I won't read the mission. It's says he's running nice things about universities and so forth, but this is worth spending a little time on. This year has 4,500 students and about 220 full-time faculty. And as you can see, it's got all the departments, institutes, schools, and centers. I asked Abid, what's the difference between an institute and a center? And he said, whenever you get a good leader, you give them enough space and let them run with it. Obviously, the schools are degree granting institutions. We at Brac are putting on, he's, by the way, got plans for building in Bangladesh, something as majestic, I hope, as this, and he's trying to raise the funds for it, and our Brac USA group is leading in. But the organizational evolution, which is the second question of the future, I think, what do you do? You have basically 3 people heading those 3 separate entities, and then within each of those, you have maybe altogether 25 to 30 program or other project directors. And of course, some are huge and some are very, very small. And right now, there's a board of directors, but basically Abid runs that, okay, because they defer to him as the executive chairman. There's an executive director who runs a development program, but he defers a lot to the various people who run the programs. And then actually the social enterprise and investment director is really quite an entrepreneurial businessman who, at the 40th Brac anniversary to which my wife and I attended, he got up and he talked about the salary cut he had to negotiate to shift from business to taking this particular job. Abid would write his salary on a little piece of paper and give it to him, and he kept on saying, well, can we do a little bit better? But he never recovered anything close to his private sector salary. But he said it was the biggest gift he's ever had in his life because he finds this work to be much more rewarding than any money he was making. And he's obviously not living poorly. It's just that he's not able to earn the kinds of salary he was drawing in the private sector. Yes?
Who invests in these social enterprises?
Brac does. Yeah, they're owned and operated by Brac.
There are no private investors.
Only the Brac Bank, I think, had some private investors at the beginning. Yeah. They may have been bought out now, because I know that one of them was, there's a community bank in the U.S. named South Shore Bank, which is very famous for microfinance. They were the group that helped Brac, but also they were big help to Grameen, because one of the other things Ford Foundation did was, when Bangladesh was starting on the microfinance revolution, it brought the American community banks that had a lot of banking technical expertise to Bangladesh to help develop the internal banking systems for Grameen and Brac. So South Shore was one of those, and they invested in the Brac Bank, I know that. But I don't think any of the others are privately owned by anybody else. Yeah. Okay, so it has a board of directors, it has these leaders. Obviously, The key question is what's going to happen when Abid, this is the, I think this was the wedding of Abid's daughter that my wife Marty and I were at, and this is Aminul Islam, who was the number 2. We always called him the field general because he ran all the field operations, and he was a genius implementer. He was a genius. You give him, he was, people would say, well, we don't understand this guy because he comes into the country and he doesn't go to the government offices. He doesn't. He gets off the plane, he gets into a Jeep, and he goes out for 4 days, and then he comes back and said, okay, we're going to do this program, that program, this program, that program. He goes out in the community, and then he closes down and he fires people, okay? So and hires people. But the guy was an absolute field genius, and he and my wife started together in the field in Bangladesh. This was in 1973, 74, 75. And the reason I have him there is because he passed away from a heart attack 2 years ago. So the succession for him has been very traumatic, because how do you replace your field general? But obviously we're also talking about how is Abid going to replace himself? And is there a last will and testament, or how is that? Now, he does have 2 children with Bahar, Tamara and Shamran. Both of them have major roles in the organization, but I don't know whether they'll do a Gandhi dynasty type of thing in Bangladesh, where Tamara is she's got a MBA from Columbia in business management. She worked at Goldman Sachs and then just decided to come back to Bangladesh. And she runs the Arong, the handicraft industry, which has done fantastically well. And Shamron is now the sole director of the microfinance in all 11 countries. So he's got a huge load. But I think nobody knows the answer to this succession question. And obviously, Abid is clever enough to know that the success of what he's done will depend on how this succession is navigated. He's about 75, 76. Actually, we went to his 75th birthday, so he's 76, I think, right now. He had a fairly serious illness 6 months ago. Went to Bangkok, but fortunately, knock on wood, he's fully recovered, as you could see from that photograph. It was just a couple of months ago. So that's the story of a remarkable story. It's 30, 40 years of work by Abid, this remarkable person who, because of leadership, motivation, capability, because of the right context, the right timing, because of good luck, because the donors are there to provide some support, and he at least didn't pay attention to their bad advice, and because the government in Bangladesh allowed a creature like this to grow without choking it off, he's now started a university. We'll see how well it competes with the global Jindal Global University. He was very wise. He appointed as his first vice chancellor the dean of the engineering university there, who has good foreign trained engineer and is a good university. But that person is now transitioned and he's moved on to heavy traffic. Actually, Bangladesh, Dhaka is one of the worst, most congested cities in the world now. The pollution is terrible. And you have to plan your day around the traffic. So if I want to go from Gulshan, a suburb, to Dalmundi, I just can't do it in one day. It'll take me an overnight to do the movement. So it's really, and the number of failed governments just has not put in the infrastructure for the population and the growth. But despite that, and I will close with this statement and then leave Sudarshan to answer the question about the Indian government. Despite that, there are many studies showing that Bangladesh, in human development, in health, education, in gender especially, for a Muslim society, has been really quite outstanding in terms of its progress. But in economics, income inequality, and in the sheer level of poverty, it's still a backward country. Indian government.
Well, let me